I had a dream last night. Leia, Molly, Connor, and I were in Algebra 1 class. Mrs. Gluth was our Algebra 1 teacher. We were celebrating Mrs. Gluth's and Mrs. Rogers' birthdays. Mrs. Gluth said, "Ladies and gentlemen, before we have some cake, let's do a few math problems." Mrs. Gluth asked Leia how to solve 10x plus 54 equals minus 7 by minus 14. Leia said, "Add both sides by 7x. Mrs. Gluth said, "What do you get?" Leia said, 17x plus 54 equals minus 14. Mrs. Gluth asked, "What do you do next, Leia?" Leia said, "Subtract 54 by both sides." Mrs. Gluth asked, "You get what, Leia?" Leia said, 17x equals minus 68. Mrs. Gluth asked, "What do you do last, Leia?" Leia said, "Divide both sides by 17. Mrs. Gluth asked, "What's your final answer?" Leia said, "It is x equals 5,865,193,232. Mrs. Gluth yelled, "Leia, are you that stupid? It is not x equals 5,865,193,232. It is x equals minus 4. That's it, that's strike one. 2 more until you got to the principal's office. Later, when the bell rang for B lunch, all of a sudden, Leia was getting out of her seat to go to lunch. We were in C lunch, not B lunch. Mrs. Rogers yelled, "Leia, get back over here now." But she didn't listen, so Mrs. Gluth yelled,
"Hey! The bell doesn't dismiss you. I do. Now sit down."
MRS, Gluth said, "Leia tot strike 2, 1 more until you go to the principal's office." Later, when MRS, Rogers lit the candles to sing happy birthday.
Mrs. Gluth said, "Leia, that's strike 2, 1 more until you go to the principal's office." Later, when Mrs. Rogers lit the candles to sing happy birthday to Mrs. Gluth and Mrs. Rogers, all of a sudden, Jasmine told Mrs. Rogers, "Don't lit the candles yet, the cake is going to," but it was too late. The cake suddenly blew up and it got all over the classroom and us. Mrs. Rogers asked everyone, "Does anyone know how the cake blew up?" "Yes, Jasmine?" Jasmine said, "I saw Leia putting TNT in your cake while you guys weren't looking." Mrs. Gluth yelled at her super duper extremely loudly, "Leia, look what you did. You blew up the cake. Now we are covered in cake. Thanks to you. That's it. That's strike 3. You're going to the principal's office, Leia, in a deep man voice." Leia yells, "No, she got expelled." When we got home, I yelled at her very loudly and grounded her forever. And she went, "Wawa wawa 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 wawa. Like, subscribe, comment.